A new poll has found that ANC support has dropped to below 30%. Remember that the ANC is used to having about 2/3 of the support in elections in this country, and that during the last election support has dropped from around 60% to about 40%. Now it seems that this support is dwindling even more. This poll was published by the DA, of course, the official opposition in South Africa, who are also part of the Government of National Unity. Now you might of course say that surely the DA would say such a thing, but the fact that the DA has published the report does not by definition make the report incredible, because DA polling has been fairly credible and accurate in the past. If this poll is accurate, it effectively means that the ANC has dropped since the last election with a further 11%. According to this poll, the ANC is currently at 29% support, the DA at 28%, the MK party of Jacob Zuma at 11%, the EFF of Julius Malema at 8%, and the IFP at 3%. The poll also finds that the DA is ahead of the ANC in several metros, including Johannesburg and the Pretoria area, also known as the Tshwane Metro. Now we need to talk about this, about what this means, and also about what could happen in the next few years in South Africa. Now, people in South Africa have developed a somewhat embarrassing habit of premature celebration, especially when news is reported that could somehow be interpreted as good news for the country. We saw that, for example, years ago, you might have forgotten, when Jacob Zuma was elected to be the new president of the ANC and of course the new candidate to be president of South Africa, to take over from Thabo Mbeki. We then saw the same thing when Cyril Ramaphosa was announced to be the ANC's candidate for the election, and of course when he won the election in 2019, famously leading to news reports and editorial comments such as Adrian Basson of News 24 calling Cyril Ramaphosa majestic and a great leader and so forth. We then saw the same type of excitement during the COVID era, at least initially, and then of course last year when the ANC's support dropped dramatically and when the Government of National Unity was announced. It was widely believed that this Government of National Unity would be the solution, or some form of a solution. Of course, where we stand today, there is a significant disillusionment with the Government of National Unity. But perhaps we shouldn't blame people for being so excited about what could potentially be interpreted as good news, because people are indeed desperate for good news. What is, however, important and what we need to do is to convey the message and to help spread the word that people should broaden their horizons, that people should stop looking for solutions primarily within the party political system in South Africa and recognize that in many fundamental ways, it is the political system that facilitates the problems that we experience in this country. This is the reason why these bursts of excitement are usually short-lived, because they aren't grounded in reality. And the reality is, as we have been saying at Lex Libertas, that many of these problems that people regard as the problems in South Africa are in fact symptoms of a deeper rooted problem. The deeper-rooted problem is the fact that the political system does not speak to realities on ground level to such an extent that if a different party or a different president were to take over, we must not be so naive as to think that that would suddenly imply that these problems would go away. The country would still suffer from extreme levels of unemployment, from a high demand for socialist policies, from high levels of crime, from intercommunal conflict or friction, and from the fact that the country is inhabited by a variety of communities who have different perspectives of history, different cultures, different narratives, different philosophical outlooks, and very importantly, different views on constitutionalism. In other words, different views on what the state ought to be and what the state ought to do, which means that these different communities naturally interpret the text of the Constitution in fundamentally different ways. These realities will not go away. That does not mean that it is not important to get rid of the ANC. Of course we should get rid of the ANC because the ANC has made things significantly worse. But we must also bear in mind that replacing the ANC with another party would not simply imply that these things would go away. The only real tangible solution is an alternative political system, one that is decentralized and one that facilitates much higher levels of autonomy. And so it is good news if the DA is gaining ground at the expense of the ANC. It is good news if other opposition parties are also gaining ground. And it is good news if parties like the ANC, like the MK party, and like the Economic Freedom Fighters are losing support. But at the end of the day, we ought to recognize that if one of these alternative parties were to take over, these problems would not go away. And in fact, that an alternative approach to governing the country might lead to new forms of friction, riots, and so forth. This is not an attempt to be overly pessimistic, but it is an attempt to bring some realism to the conversation and to say that if we truly want a sustainable solution in this country, we need to move towards a system that facilitates autonomy and self-governance. And so if we were to measure a party, it should not merely be by the extent to which they are gaining support at the expense of the ANC, but by the extent to which this party is willing to play a supportive role in the process to facilitate tangible long-term solutions, which necessarily implies thinking outside of the box, thinking creatively about macro political solutions. Now, we should add to the conversation what might happen in the years to follow. We should remember that the ANC has developed a habit of pulling leaders shortly before elections. It happened with Thabo Mbeki, who became quite unpopular during the end of his term. It happened with Jacob Zuma, who was even more unpopular, and now Cyril Ramaphosa is also even more unpopular, which means that it's highly predictable that they would announce before the next election that Cyril Ramaphosa would not be the president anymore and that he would be replaced by a new leader, and it does seem at this stage that that person would most probably be Paul Mashatile, which would provide the ANC with some form of an opportunity to present itself as having a blank slate and of not taking responsibility for the failures of Cyril Ramaphosa. This would, if history is any indication, lead to publications such as News 24 celebrating the leadership of Paul Mashatile and presenting the ANC as a movement that has been reformed and that could perhaps be trusted once again. This means that even though polling that indicates that the ANC is losing significant support at this stage is good news, it is certainly way too early to make long-term predictions. What we need to do, however, in the run-up to the election, and in fact, regardless of electoral outcomes, is to build momentum on this movement to say that South Africa needs a more sustainable political dispensation, which, as far as we are concerned, ought to be a decentralized dispensation and one that facilitates autonomy and self-governance.